Welcome back to Musa Theories. It's been a while since we did a Musa Theory episode. So today's Musa Theory episode, we're just going to talk about some bit of African history, African politics, and we're going to learn some bit of Africa. I'm going to educate you about Africa. That was Africa pre-colonial and Africa after colonialism. So we'll start with my country, where I come from. I come from Kenya. So before colonialism, there was something called, when the British came, there was something called collaborators and the rebellious tribes. So collaborators were people who were supporting the British rule, and the rebellious were people who were not supporting the British rule. So if you look at, let's go to a country like Kenya, like East Africa generally. So East Africa it started with Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Right now it has grown to Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Congo, South Sudan, Somalia. I think that's it for the East African Confederation. But going back to pre-colonial times, a good country of collaborators was Uganda, which was used by the British. They used something called the indirect rule, because the British used either direct rule or indirect rule. So, what is indirect rule? What is direct rule? Indirect rule is whereby the British will use the kings, the chiefs, and other African people to govern African societies. Direct rule, like the one that was used to Kenya, is whereby they just put their own British people to rule the country, whereby they wouldn't use any other African people. That's why if you look at a country like today, like Uganda, still has the kingdoms. You look at the kingdom of the Buganda kingdom. There's the Basoga kingdom. There's the Banyankole kingdom. So the Buganda kingdom, they still have the Kabaka up to today. The Busoga kingdom, they still have someone called the Chabazinga up today. That was basically indirect rule. They use the kings. When you go to a place like Kenya and Tanzania, they used just the British governor. That's why they used to call it the British East African Imperial Company. Basically, it was a company which was in charge of taking care of those countries. But now let's look at some of the tribes that were collaborators and some that were not collaborators. If you look at Kenya, we look at a tribe called the Kikuyu. They used to have a movement called the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau literally translate to Mzungu arudi Ulaya, Mwafrika apate uhuru. Basically, they just said the colonialists need to go back to Europe and the Africa needs to take up their own charge. So the Mau Mau had like leaders like Dedan Kimathi, that was General China. But interestingly enough, most of the rebellious people in Africa were people who were taken to fight in World War One. Interestingly, World War One happened in somewhere in 1945. If you look at African history, after 1945, 1950, that's when most African countries were getting independence. Why? Because most of these people were taken to fight in the World War, so they learned a few skills whereby they went back home and they were like, hey, we can use these guns like these other people. Why don't we use it to fight for ourselves? If you go to other African countries, like let's say Mozambique, they had like rebellious groups. They call themselves the Frelimo, the French liberation movement of Mozambique, which was led by a guy called Samora Machel. So here's an interesting fact about Samora Machel. Samora Machel married a lady. She was called Gracia. When Samora died, Gracia Machel went and married Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela's wife was the ex-wife of the neighboring country's president who had passed away. So everyone in Africa, mostly in South Africa, they know Grasa Machel. Now we go to a place like South Africa, some of the rebellious groups. We look at when they started the ANC, the African National Union. Before we could see people like Mandela, we saw people like Steve Biko, a student leader, people who fought for South African freedom. We also look like the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Actually, interestingly, in the next episode of Musa Theories, we look at Desmond Tutu's philosophy of Ubuntu. Basically, Ubuntu means you are because I am, and I am because you are. When we go to a country like Egypt, we saw people who fought against the British, like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who took over throne, and they removed the Suez Canal from the British, and they nationalized it. Up to today, the Suez Canal is owned by the Egyptian people. Then when you go to a country like Tanzania, the people who fought, the Tanzanians, actually Tanzania has a very unique history when it comes to colonialism. You look at when there was World War, when the British defeated the Germans, the British took over Tanzania from the Germans. But before that, it was the Germans who were the colonial masters of Britain. But before that, we look at there was a leader in Tanzania called Kinjekitile Ngwale. So here's a short story about that guy. So what this guy did, he wanted he wanted to make the people of Tanzania have the confidence to fight the Germans. First of all, Tanzania is a combination of two countries. That's Tanganyika and Zanzibar. Tanganyika is the mainland, and then Zanzibar is an island. So when you combine those two, is Tanzania, whereby Tanganyika produces the president and Zanzibar produces the vice president. So basically, Kinjekitile Ngwale started a rebellion called the Maji Maji. When you translate Maji from Swahili to English, Maji literally means water. So what did this guy do? This guy was known as a traditional healer or a wizard, whatever you may call them. He told the people like, I will turn the German bullets into water. So when you go attack them, when they fire, the bullets will turn into water. Your guess is as good as mine. I don't think the magic worked. So when the people went to fight the Germans, of course, very many people died. Even Germans lost some of their people. That's why we have, it is known as the Maji Maji Rebellion, whereby so many people died. And from that, the Germans started making some changes, of which the changes didn't end up until when the war started, then the British took over. That's why now Tanzania was given to, was literally given to the British. So we continue to other African countries. We go to like a place like Congo, where they had their own rebellions against the king of Belgium, King Leopold, who used the people to take over their stuff. Although this rebellion wasn't that much strong compared to other countries. Then we go to another country like, Kenya, we still had other countries still fighting. No, the thing is this, with African countries, there were so many rebellions inside of it, but it didn't work out. But now when we move to from colonial Africa now to post-colonialism, we still had other rebellions. When you look at Nigerians after colonialism, they had something called the Biafra crisis, whereby part of the Biafra crisis was basically controlled by the Igbo tribe, by a guy called Colonel Ojukwu. For the Nigerians, please correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, Colonel Ojukwu was the leader of the Biafra crisis, whereby he wanted to secede Nigeria from secede the main Igbo land, which is rich of oil, from other parts of Nigeria. That didn't work out because we all know one Nigeria. So the Biafra crisis, it was there, yes, but it didn't go through. There was another secession still, but that's a recent one. When we look at the separation of Sudan, Sudan used to be the biggest country in Africa, but now it's no longer Sudan, it's Algeria. Why? Because Sudan was divided. There was South Sudan, then there's the actual Sudan. Here is a fun fact about Sudan. Sudan has the biggest cotton farming in the whole of Africa, which is known as the Gezira plantation, which was started by the British, but is still the biggest cotton producing land in Africa. That's Gezira plantation. But coming to all this was it was inspired by one of an old revolution that happened in Europe. All these rebellions in Africa, like remember when I told you like most Africans who went to fight in the war are the ones who came back to Africa to help fight the European colonialism. You'll be surprised by which revolution. It was all started by the French Revolution. So, in this part, I will explain what the French Revolution is. So, the French Revolution started in 1889 by the calling of the Estates General. So, before the French Revolution started, there was a king in France called King Louis XVI. So King Louis XVI was basically a very extravagant king. He had a wife called Marie Antoinette. Actually, there is a quote. Most people say it's not actually what happened, but literally she said that when people came to protest at the Versailles Palace, people protesting against the price of bread. She literally told them like, hey, if the price of bread is so expensive, why don't you buy cakes? That's ironic, right? If bread is expensive, cake is supposed to be way more expensive. Anyway, that was King Louis the 16th wife. So the French Revolution basically started when King Louis had issues he called the Estates Generals. So calling of the Estate Generals basically means he called the MPs to the parliament. When he called the MPs to the parliament, things didn't go so well because this was like, it was actually after 16 years is when the parliament was being called in for the first time. So they took this chance to start complaining about the situation of the country. They were not happy with the Catholic Church by then because the Catholic Church by then was charging tithe to all the people, which was by force. Tithe then during King Louis the 16th, tithe was literally by force. You couldn't do anything about it. You just had to pay tithe, which was controlled by the church. So the people were like, nah, we cannot continue doing this. So what they did was they started attacking the French government, which was under the King Louis. What they did, they went and they stormed the biggest prison in France. And the biggest prison in France, I think, is still there up to date. It's called the La Bastille. I think they still have the La Bastille day up to today. And their motto was L'égalité, fraternité, and equalité, if I'm not wrong. This was one of the inspiring moments especially for mostly French African countries, or like if the French could revolt against their own king, why not us? We can get their own freedom. But continuing with the French Revolution, so when they fought against King Louis the 16th, he tried to escape, but they literally got him and they put him on something called the guillotine. The guillotine was started by a French doctor called Dr. D. Guillotine. He's the one who built, I'm sure you people have watched those movies whereby they put someone's neck in like a piece of wood, then there's like a blade coming from up. That's the guillotine. It was started by a doctor called Dr. Guillotine. It was literally named after him. Apparently, I'm not sure, but he was killed by the same machine. So the king was killed by that. But then there was a kind of certain of a fracas. This is also whereby African countries got the idea of starting political parties, because after the French Revolution, there was a thing called the French elites, the middle class, the people, the lawyers, the doctors. They started their own factions of political parties. There was the Jacobins, the Girondins, a whole group of people. They're the ones who were trying to run France, but then things didn't go as planned because France was still in kind of a sort of a chaotic moment. But then, guess what? This is what gave birth to one of the biggest historical figures on earth, whereby when France was in shambles, then the name Napoleon was born. So the French Revolution gave birth to Napoleon Bonaparte, a small guy from an island called Corsica. I'm not wrong about that one. Actually, there's a movie that came out the other day in all cinemas about Napoleon. If you have time, go watch it. But all this shaped African political scenarios, because after all this, the people who went to fight in World War, they were not just fighting; they were learning about European culture. So they were learning about European culture, they found out like Europe used to be like Africa at one point. Most people look at Germany today and they think Germany was just one country. Like, no, Germany used to be so many countries back then. They used to be Germany never used to be called Germany. There was Prussia, there was Bavaria, there was so many states. If you look at Italy never used to be just one country. In Italy there was Naples, there was which other? There was Venice. There was so many other countries. There were cities, basically city states. It wasn't just one. Italy is recent. Germany is recent. They are all just states that usually just came together. For Germany, actually, it's even interesting. Germany was united under King Frederick the Seventh, if I am not wrong, who came, but the person who really brought it into life was someone called Otto von Bismarck. So Otto von Bismarck helped the king to unite Germany. The same Otto von Bismarck is the one who called the Berlin Conference. This is where the African map was drawn for the first time. Africa didn't have a map. There was no Nigeria. There was no Kenya. There was no South Africa. All this was done in the Berlin Conference, whereby the British, the German, everyone was drawing up their own kinds of lands, and they were all given out. Like a place like South Africa was given to the British, but the British now gave it to someone called Cecil Rhodes. That's why if you look at a country like Zambia and Zimbabwe, that's not their names during the colonial times. Colonial times, Zambia and Zimbabwe was Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, because it was owned by the Rhodes family. Even if you look at some of the companies right now in South Africa, basically in most South African countries, you'll see the Rhodes name because they used to own it. Going back to the French Revolution, so we look at how the French Revolution acted, whereby the people were able to revolt against the government and change a whole system. These African people who went to fight the war in these other countries were like, hey, if the Europeans had this kind of issues, we have this kind of issues, but now we're just Europeans. Just need to start fighting. That's why we had those freedom movements coming to Africa. But here now is the problem. What happened to Africa? The rebellious movements were attached to certain tribes. That's why if you look at mostly African history, after colonialism, there's so much civil wars. If you look at some of the biggest civil wars in Africa, look at the Rwandan genocide, whereby we had the Hutu and the Tutsi fighting because the Belgians couldn't decide who should be the leader after they left. But it all happened. It's a very sad history. But after colonialism, there was a wave of so many civil wars. If you look at Angola, there was a guy called Jonas Savimbi. There was so many things going on. Even in, let's say, like, which other country? There were so many countries going through civil war, and all these civil war were either religiously based or tribal based, but most of them were tribal based because when the revolution movements were started, they were all connected just to a certain tribe. If you look at Kenya, when I mentioned the Mau Mau were basically just one tribe, one Kikuyu tribe. It wasn't a mix of other tribes. It's only later that it came to be other tribes. But when it started, it was just only one tribe. So Africans copied most of the things, but just not everything. As much as we fought colonialism, we got another problem, civil war. So we started civil war. There's tribalism. If you look at most African countries, there's just they have a history of tribalism. Mention any country, there's tribalism. But in today's episode, we want to look at how we can solve all these problems. When you look at Africa right now, we still have like so many borders which were drawn up by the Europeans. If you look at East Africa, most borders are cut in between whereby there's one tribe, but I'll give you an example. An example is a border between Kenya and Uganda. Between the border of Kenya and Uganda, there's only one tribe. There's the Teso tribe in Kenya, then there's also the Teso tribe in Uganda. In Uganda, there's Teso, in Kenya, there's Teso. But there's the border dividing. So there's Kenyan Tesos, then there's Ugandan Tesos. It was done deliberately. So it was basically divide and rule. So some of the things like Africa needs to do to get out of that tribalism net is just get rid of all those borders and just create like one visa. Anyway, as we go back to the French Revolution, we look at the things that caused the revolution. Religion was one of the biggest things. So when you look at the French, what they did during the French Revolution, in the church of Notre Dame, people literally pulled down all the statues. Then they put up a statue of a lady. They called it the statue of reason, the goddess of reason, whereby they said in this country we will only lead by reason, not religion, because most people choose different religions, right? There will be freedom of religion. So they chose the goddess of reason. That's why if you look at most westernized governments, they really don't like being centered around one religion. They just accept everyone, which was a big weakness when it came to African copying things after colonialism, because all African countries, if you look at them right now, they're either Christian or Muslim. Like if you look at the northern African parts like Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, the president there has to be has to be Muslim. If you look at Southern African countries, whereby the dominant religion is not Islam, the president has to come from Christianity. That's basically Africa for you. Every leader has to conform with the religion of the country, of which the African traditional society was put aside, which was a big weakness according to me. Big weakness. The African traditional heritage, our culture, was put aside. So most African countries, either they conform to Christianity or they conform to Islam. That's it. There's nothing like, oh, I can be something else. There's no African leader who can say they're from something else, unless maybe South Africa has tried, because some of their presidents, we've seen some of them, I'm not a supporter of this, but some of their presidents like to favor the African traditional way of living. When you look like a president, like the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, He took African traditional heritage. Is it the Zulu of the Hosa, whereby we know the side they're polygamous. So he keeps on marrying other women. We also look at other African countries that still have kings, like the king controls the country. We look at a country like Swaziland, whereby the king chooses a new wife every year. There's actually an actual competition whereby the women dance naked and then the king has to choose one woman every year. Interesting. I'm actually looking forward to one day attending to that event, seeing how things go. You never know. But now going to African issues after colonialism, then the biggest weakness now is when we started now following the European culture, even our political parties now started even instead of following following a national agenda, it was all a tribalistic agenda. If you look at most political parties in Africa, there's always a dominant tribe. I will give you like a country like mine in Kenya, whereby we have a political party called the Orange Democratic Movement. This political party is majorly backed by one tribe, which is the Luo. That's it. When you look at other countries, it's one and the same thing. We just following what our colonialists did. We did not follow what we wanted to do. So, in my opinion, for Africa to move forward, we need to rewrite our history a little bit. We need to put away some of the colonial tendencies we have, some of the colonial bad habits we have of basing our struggles our tribes. We should base just our struggles to other challenges which we are currently facing. Because hey, if bread is expensive to everyone. It's not just expensive to one single tribe. It's expensive to everyone and everyone else. But moving to a little bit out of African history, when you look at African history, actually, here's a fun fact: the first black African country to have independence was Ghana in 1957 under a leader called Kwame Nkurumah. So, Kwame Nkurumah called a meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the only African country that wasn't colonized. Actually, they defeated the Italians in a battle called the Battle of Adwa, which they won. So, Kwame Nkrumah called all African leaders to come to Ethiopia, where they formed the OAU, which is now the AU. So the OAU was the Organization of African Unity, which is now just called AU. So he called all African leaders then who had gained independence and told them, hey, right now we just need to form one country and just call it Africa. But because the African leaders didn't want to lose, in my opinion, lose their status of just being presidents, they refused. So they just went back to become their own things, like become their own presidents. So they refused it. The second person to bring up this idea was a man who's hated and loved by many. He's called Colonel Muammar al-Qaddafi, as all of you know him as Gaddafi. He brought up the idea. We all know what happened to him. Gone. But basically, the point of uniting Africans has been a problem. But as you can see, Ghana tried through Kwame Nkrumah to unite Africa, but he refused. Because even just starting the organization OAU, other African countries refused to join. For example, when you look like to a country like Morocco, Morocco was part of the African Union, but at one point it moved away from the African Union because the African Union refused to ratify that Western Sahara is part of Morocco. The African Union looked at Western Sahara as just its own country, yet Morocco claims Western Sahara as its own, which is creating so many weaknesses into the African unity. Another thing creating the disorganizing African unity is multiple colonialists. If you look at majorly East and South Africa was majorly controlled by the British. When you look at West, most of it was controlled by the French, apart from Nigeria and Ghana. All the other countries in West Africa, they are all francophone. So even if you look at like a country like Cameroon, whereby when we were looking at civil wars, their civil war is basically the Anglophone and the Francophones. They're fighting over the language, which is not even theirs. This has been going on for years and years. The Anglophones versus the Francophones. Then when you look at other countries like Congo, basically there's a civil war, but most people call this the African war, whereby most African countries are just trying to get minerals or become brokers of minerals. Everyone knows what's going on in Congo. Like I am sure if you have an iPhone, probably one part or a couple parts from your iPhone come from Congo. So that's a civil war caused by the minerals. So basically, what they own is no longer then a blessing, it's a curse. So as we go forward, let me take a sip. As we go forward, when you look at other countries which were colonized by other countries like Portugal and Spain, basically, if you look at a country like Angola, they had their own civil war. If you look at even Uganda, most countries in Africa literally had civil war, whether you like it or not. It just happens like what's the cause of the civil war? Either it's language, tribe, or political party function. I'll give an example of Kenya. We had a civil war in 2007 called the post-election violence. It may sound recent, but its roots go deep down all the way to colonialism. All these things just comes all the way from how the colonial rule shaped our future. The question is now, how do we face our future now? What do we need to get rid of to move on? So this brings us to the end of our part one of the crash course of African history. My name is Moses, and thanks for watching Mosa Theories.